Alright guys, so I'm gonna let you all in on a little secret. Originally, this channel was gonna be concentrated on one topic, which was population, demographics, and I was gonna call it population collapse because looking at the trends here, I think we're heading for an absolute disaster worldwide. The population could collapse. When I say collapse, it doesn't mean it'll go from like 8 billion to zero within a couple of years. Collapse can happen over a longer period of time, relatively speaking. We could be talking 50, 100 years, which in the timeline of history is really a blink of the eye. So in terms of definitions, collapse may seem over-exaggerated and scaremongering, but it could very well happen that the human population will collapse over the next 100 years, or maybe even sooner, maybe the next 50 years. And there's strong evidence that this will happen, maybe not on the entire planet, but certainly certain countries are looking at population catastrophe, collapse if you like. So this video is kind of like an introduction into this subject I'm going to be talking about a lot. As I said, it was going to be an entire channel. Then I decided, well, I wanted to talk about some other subjects as well. So then it became a more general channel talking about other subjects I'm interested in. Very few people seem interested in this topic because most people seem to think that the problem with population is overpopulation. There's too many people on the planet. And over the last 100 years or so, the population of the earth has exploded. So this idea that overpopulation is a problem has persisted, and it's understandable why. But we're seeing changes in that trend. We're seeing population stagnation, and in some countries we're starting to see a decline already. Now there are some countries that are seeing a population explosion, and that explosion is set to continue for at least the next 20, 30 years. But we don't know. I'm going to be looking at lots of statistics on population. Now there is one person who's been sounding alarm bells, and that person is none other than Elon Musk, who is apparently the world's richest man now. So here's a tweet from him from 2017. The world's population is accelerating towards collapse, but few seem to notice or care. So that was about 5 years ago. Now here is Elon Musk's response to a tweet from Josh Kaplan. Elon Musk says civilization is going to crumble unless people have more children. And Musk simply says it's true. Here is an article. Now I want to focus your attention just on the title of the article. Elon Musk's surprising comments about the threat of falling birth rates. So this guy describes it as surprising. This is because most people think that the problem is still overpopulation, and I'm going to show you some stats that may disprove that. So here he says, I can't emphasize this enough, said the CEO of Tesla and SpaceX. There are not enough people. One of the biggest risks to civilization is the low birth rate and the rapidly declining birth rate. So birth rates are getting lower and lower. People are having less children. Population collapse is potentially the greatest risk to the future of civilization. So that was another tweet from Musk, I think it was a year or two ago. Now here, let's have a look at some data and predictions. And while other estimates predict the world population will peak at around 9.7 billion by 2050, the world's current population being 7.8 billion, recent research foresees an impending decline to 8.79 billion by 2100. Bear that number in mind. They reckon that the population will decline to 8.79 billion. Now it hasn't reached that yet, but it is expected to grow to 9.7 or even higher than that. So we're going to be looking at a bunch of different charts and predictions. So in the US, census figures show the population has climbed just 7% from 2010, falling short of expectations. So the US population didn't rise as fast as they thought it would in the last 10 years. And here in red, the study forecasts that in around 23 countries, including Japan, Thailand, Spain and Ukraine, populations are expected to decline by 50% or more. So that's over the next 80 years. So look at that, 50% or more. So these countries could have half the population they have right now. So that is As far as I'm concerned, that fits the definition of collapse. It may be over, 80 years or so, but as I said, over the timeline of history, even just human history, that's just a blink of an eye. That is collapse right there. So here we have a map of the world showing populations. We have India and China, the only two countries with populations over 1 billion. And then we have countries like the US, Brazil, Indonesia that have populations of over 200 million. So this is the live population, 7.9 billion. So we're rapidly heading towards 8 billion. Now, here are some sentences I want to highlight. Every 5 years since the 1970s, the population growth rate has continued to fall. So the growth rate peaked in the 1970s. And then ever since then, the growth rate has fallen. So even though the population has increased quite a lot since the 70s, the growth rate has fallen. So we're going to be looking at that in a minute. So by 2030, the population will exceed 8 billion. So it looks like that will be exceeded within the next year or two. In 2040, this number will grow to more than 9 billion. So about 18 years from now, we could hit 9 billion. In 2055, the number will rise to over 10 billion. And another billion people won't be added until the end of the century. So we're seeing increases of about 1 billion every decade. And then it'll take 15 years to go from 8 to 9 billion. But then it's going to take about 45 years to go from 9 billion to 10 billion. So that's what I mean by the growth rate declining. That it's going to take much longer to add 1 billion more people. And some people think that this may not even happen, that the population will decline much faster than that. So here we have the world population clock heading rapidly towards 8 billion. Now this one here, today's date is December 21st, 2021. This one is saying it's already reached 8 billion. So getting the exact number of the world population is very difficult. Some countries have poor statistics. Censuses usually take place every 10 years in each country, so a lot of this is just projections and estimates. So here's a list of each country. China's on top, India second, US third, Indonesia fourth. Here we see the growth rates for each country, the percentage of the world population for each country. So China has fairly close to 20% of the world's population. Almost 1 in 5 people are Chinese. US has 4%, just over 4% of the world's population. Now here we can see the growth rate in green, countries that are increasing population. And then if we go through the list, you can see some countries like Russia and Japan, their populations are already declining. So Russia minus 0.02%, Japan 0.3%. Now most are still increasing, but we're going to be seeing more and more countries in red here. Here's Romania, lost 0.5%. Cuba, 0.08%. So this is from 2020 to 2021, I believe. Yeah, so the 2020 population versus the 2021 population. And for some countries, this is going to be a huge disaster in the decades to come. Look at Lebanon losing almost 1% of their population. And look at this, over 1%, Puerto Rico and Lithuania. Now, a lot of Puerto Ricans, they immigrate to the US. Puerto Ricans, they are US citizens, so they can travel freely to the US. Let's go down here. So, Wallis and Fortuna, well, that's like a small island, so I wouldn't read too much into that drop, but it's a big drop of over 1%. Now, look at this graph here. World population 1950 to 2100. So here we are, 2021. So you can see before this year, 2021, it rose. Look at the steady rise there. That's a pretty steep rise. But look how it's projected to level off around the middle of the century. By about 2050, it's really going to level off here. This is the prediction, but as I've said, as I showed in that article, the populations are not increasing as quickly as projected over the last 15, 20 years. So here's some stats here. Now here's a fascinating graph here. This is the world population 5000 BC to 2020 AD. Now look how it just absolutely goes crazy here from about 1650, the Industrial Revolution. It just skyrockets and it's almost completely vertical here. A crazy increase. So the Industrial Revolution really triggered off huge population growth. And let's go down here. And here we can see the list. Now the growth rate, it's mostly green, but you can see some red here over the millennia. Now I want to focus your attention on these paragraphs because these are super important. What happens next isn't quite so clear. Most people agree that population increases will continue, but there are arguments about the rate of increase, and even a few people who believe population decreases are likely. So that would be Elon Musk, myself, and a few others. You can see some example trends in this graph. The United Nations has gradually been revising its predictions downwards. So this is probably the most important sentence of all, because it shows you that the UN, they've been making predictions for decades now. The UN was formed in 1948, so they've been making predictions since then. So over the last 70 odd years, their predictions have been trending downwards. In other words, if you looked at UN predictions from like 20, 30 years ago, they might have estimated the population would increase to maybe 15, 16 billion by the end of this century. So it believes that as the world grows steadily richer and the average family size decreases, growth will steadily slow and eventually stop. So we're going to look at that in a second. So others believe that poverty, inequality, and continued urbanization will encourage steadily increasing growth, particularly in countries in Africa and parts of Asia. So Africa especially is predicted to grow quite a lot for at least the next couple of decades. But this one really caught my eye because urbanization is typically associated with population decrease. So people who live in urban areas typically have smaller families than people in rural areas. So this doesn't make sense to me. But poverty and inequality do drive up birth rates. So these two do make sense. But urbanization doesn't. And Africa is getting urbanized pretty quickly right now. So that could decrease the predictions for Africa. A few scientists even believe that populations will decrease. Some believe that gradual increases in living standards will result in similar patterns to those in Western Europe, where birth rates are declining rapidly. Others believe that the current world population is unsustainable and predict that humanity will simply not be able to produce enough food and oil to feed itself and sustain our industrial economy. From these paragraphs, opinion is divided. Here's a population growth chart. So this is the rate of increase. And we can see that in 1970, that's when the growth rate peaked at just over 2%. And there's a huge drop off from the 1990s. So 1990 was still pretty high at 1.81%. But by 2000, the growth rate had dropped to 1.35%. So look at that huge drop. Okay, so on the left, we can see the past. And on the right, we have predictions for the future. So this one goes from bottom to top, and this one goes from top to bottom. So in 1950, the world's population was about 2.5 billion. And by 2000, it was over 6. So the world's population increased by 3.5 billion in 50 years. And by 2050, it's expected to be 9.7 billion. So from 2000, 6.1 to 9.7, so that's an increase of 3.6 billion. So roughly the same from 1950 to 2000, 3.5, from 2000 to 2050, 3.6. But then from 2050 to 2100, it's only going to increase by 1.1 billion. Look at that, 9.7 to 2100, 10.8. So an increase of just 1.1 billion in those 50 years. So that'll just show you the growth rate declining rapidly. And here we can see the actual percentages. So these actually happened here on the left. It was 1.8 in 1955, 2.07 in 1970. This is when the growth rate peaked. So when the UN in 1970, they were making their predictions, if they had thought that the growth rate would be 2.07 every year, then this number by 2100 would be way higher than 10 million. It would be maybe 16, 17 billion. But look what happened after 1970. The growth rate just continues to drop by about 0.1% every 5 years to just over 1% now in 2021. So the growth rate is half what it was in 1970. And look, by 2100, the growth rate is expected to be 0.04%. So almost no growth whatsoever. And you can see the prediction over the next 80 odd years is for the growth rate to continually decline. So by 2025, it'll be less than 1%, all the way down to practically zero growth by the end of the century. But as I pointed out in the paragraph up here, opinion is divided. So the populations are increasing in some countries, decreasing in others. So each country has its own story to tell. And I plan to do a ton of videos about individual countries and how their populations are going to affect not just their own country, but the entire planet. Like, for example, China and India, their populations are going to affect the rest of the world. Same with the United States. Now, I just want to look at one country real quick in this video. And that country is Syria. Now, look at Syria. This is the current time here, 2021. Now, look at their population. It peaked in 2010 at 21.4 million. But then, as probably almost all of you know, there's a war in Syria right now. And look how it affected the population. So I went from 21.4 million in 2010 all the way down to 16.9 million in 2018. So it dropped by about 4.5 million people. And in the last couple of years, it's gone back up, and it's expected to go back up beyond 21.5 million by 2024. And then it just shows a population increasing all the way up to about 36 million in 2090, and actually falling by the end of the century, 36.2 million. The reason I'm showing you this is because what would they have predicted back in like 2009, 2010, before this war broke out, is this graph would have been like up here, like way over 40 million, maybe even 50 million. So this war has really affected the population. And, you know, we don't know what wars are going to happen in the future. And not just wars, but we're going through the pandemic right now. That's affecting a lot of things. People dying from the virus. And then you have measures taken by governments that are affecting the economy and growth of population. So 80 years is a long time. So this population here, this is pure guesswork. To the right of this dotted red line, this is all guesswork. But we can see how an unexpected event can just decimate the population. Like right here for Syria. Due to the Syrian civil war, the Syrian population decreased between 2011 and 2018 as over 5 million people sought refuge in other countries. Since 2018, the population has started to increase again and is expected to surpass 20 million again by the end of 2023. Syria's population is expected to peak at 36.5 million in 2087 and then start to slowly decline. This is the problem with these projections. Like, nobody has a clue what's going to happen like 80 years from now. And this is where like people like Elon Musk and myself are saying, you know what, this trend could be very, very different. I mean, who knows what's going to happen with Syria with the war and stuff. And Syria is just one country, and we have all these other countries. There's like almost 200 sovereign countries in the world. And we're already seeing decreases in some of them. So guys, that's just an introduction into world population and my belief that Elon Musk is right, and his comments should not be surprising. If people are actually looking at the data and seeing what's happening, we're heading for disaster. So if this is a topic that interests you, like this video, share this video, subscribe. I'll be doing a lot more videos about this in the future. So until next time, see you guys later.